Welcome back to my channel, where real story takes its time. Let's get into it.
My name's Alfred, I'm 31, and I've always been the quiet one in my family. The one who listens more than he talks, who avoids arguments, who somehow ends up cleaning up the mess after everyone else causes it. It's not that I didn't have opinions or feelings, I just learned early on that in my family, the louder voices always won. My parents, my aunt, my cousins, they thrived on dominance and mockery disguised as family banter. And for years, I let myself believe that going along with it was easier than speaking up, until this year's birthday dinner proved just how wrong I was. To give some context, my family is complicated. I grew up in a household where success wasn't just encouraged, it was a competition. My cousin Miranda, for instance, became the doctor my Aunt Muriel bragged about to anyone who would listen. My older brother Patrick took over my father's construction business and turned it into something respectable. Meanwhile, I went my own way. I built an investment firm, slowly, from nothing but a laptop and a lot of sleepless nights. I didn't talk much about my work, mostly because no one cared to ask. They assumed I was still the artsy one who never took life seriously. I let them think that. It was easier to be underestimated. The irony was that I was the one managing the family fund, a pool of money that had started as my late grandfather's inheritance for all of us. When I graduated in finance, everyone decided I should be the one to handle it. "You're good with numbers, Alfred," my mother had said years ago, half amused. "At least you'll finally be useful." I agreed, not realizing that managing their money would one day become both my burden and my leverage. Every year, on my birthday, my aunt insisted on hosting a family dinner. It wasn't so much a celebration as it was a performance, an opportunity for everyone to show off what they'd achieved and subtly tear each other down. My Aunt Muriel always sat at the head of the table, commanding attention with her dramatic stories. My parents followed her lead, nodding at every word. Patrick usually bragged about new projects, while Miranda shared updates about her medical research. And me? I was the audience, the one who laughed when expected, listened when spoken to, and never, ever caused trouble. This year, I arrived at the restaurant 5 minutes early, dressed simply in a dark blazer and a shirt. I didn't expect much, just a polite dinner, maybe a half-hearted happy birthday, and the usual subtle jabs. But something about the evening felt different from the start. The moment I walked in, I noticed the smirk on my aunt's face, that sharp, knowing kind of smile that always meant she had something prepared. My mother barely looked up from her phone, and my brother gave me one of those forced half-hugs that felt more like an obligation than affection. "Ah, the birthday boy," my aunt announced dramatically when I sat down. "Still single, still modest, still mysterious. Tell me, Alfred, are you ever going to let us in on your big secret? What do you do all day exactly?" I smiled politely. "Work mostly. Same as always." Patrick snorted. "Work? Come on. You mean sitting behind a computer playing with numbers. You're lucky you don't have real responsibilities." The table laughed. Even my mother chuckled quietly, and I felt that familiar warmth of embarrassment crawl up my neck. It was always the same dynamic. Patrick the achiever, me the odd one out. I'd stopped defending myself long ago, because any attempt at doing so only fed them more. But that night, something inside me started to shift. Maybe it was the way they all laughed in unison, like it was rehearsed. Maybe it was the way my aunt's eyes gleamed with satisfaction as she poured herself another glass of sparkling water. Or maybe I just finally reached the point where silence didn't feel like peace anymore. It felt like surrender. Dinner went on, filled with the same stories and predictable self-praise. Miranda showed photos from her last medical conference. Patrick bragged about buying a second property. My father talked about how proud he was of his hardworking son, and I knew he didn't mean me. They went on like that for nearly an hour before anyone even mentioned my birthday. My mother finally turned toward me, smiling faintly. "So, Alfred, did you do anything exciting today? Or did you just work like usual?" "Just worked," I said. Muriel chuckled. "You know, you really should get out more. Life isn't just about work. Although, I suppose you wouldn't understand that unless you had something to show for it." Patrick grinned. He's probably saving up for another one of his mysterious projects. It was supposed to be light teasing, but it landed heavier than usual. Maybe because I'd been working harder than ever lately, expanding my firm, growing the family fund, making quiet, calculated decisions that none of them cared to know about. I had built something substantial, something that was mine, but hearing them mock me as if I were still the naive kid who didn't measure up stirred something deeper than irritation. It felt like being erased. Still, I smiled. You'll see soon enough. They laughed again, thinking it was a joke. By the time dessert came, I'd decided I was done trying to be part of their world. But the final straw came just before I could even say goodbye. The waiter brought out a slice of cake, small, simple, with a candle. My aunt raised her glass and said, "To Alfred, our family's mystery man. You may not be the pride of the family, but at least you're loyal enough to show up." I froze. Then she added, almost sweetly, "You should be thankful we even invite you. You're not exactly the pride of the family." There was a pause, a short, sharp silence where I could have said something. I could have laughed it off. I could have ignored it. But before I could decide, everyone else started laughing. My mother, my father, even Patrick slapped the table, trying not to choke on his drink. I just sat there. I looked at each of them, memorizing their faces, the smugness, the mockery, the ease with which they turned someone's dignity into a family joke. Then I smiled. It wasn't forced, not this time. It was quiet, controlled, final. When the bill came, I reached for it before anyone else could. I paid without a word. My aunt raised an eyebrow, amused. "Oh, look at you, being generous. Maybe you do make money after all." I didn't answer. I stood up, straightened my jacket, and said softly, "Enjoy the meal." Then I walked out. No dramatic exit. No scene. Just silence. The next morning, I woke up feeling strangely calm. My phone buzzed with the usual group chat messages, mostly pictures from the dinner and the same recycled jokes. I didn't respond. Instead, I opened my laptop and began reviewing the accounts linked to the family fund. Every transfer, every withdrawal, every pattern. I'd managed it faithfully for years, without taking a cent for myself. But as I looked at the balance and saw just how dependent they had all become on it, the fund they treated like an infinite well, I realized something. They thought I was the quiet one because I was weak. They forgot quiet people are the ones who see everything, remember everything, and strike when no one expects it. And 2 days later, that's exactly what I did. The morning after the dinner, I tried convincing myself to let it go. I told myself they were just being themselves, that I'd been through worse, that it wasn't worth losing sleep over. But the truth was, I didn't feel indifferent anymore. Their laughter kept replaying in my head, the way my aunt's words slid off her tongue like something rehearsed, polished, and meant to sting. "You should be thankful we even invite you." The sentence echoed in my mind while I sat at my desk, staring blankly at the spreadsheet of the family fund I'd managed for nearly 8 years. I'd handled every detail of that fund, the investments, the taxes, the reports, the withdrawals they never bothered to understand. It was meant to be a collective cushion for the family, my parents, my aunt and uncle, my cousins, and me. My grandfather had started it decades ago with the idea of keeping the family strong and united. I doubt he ever imagined it would turn into a tool for favoritism and entitlement. For years, I'd been the one to make sure everyone got their share. My parents used their portion to maintain their oversized house. My brother took frequent business loans from it, none of which he ever paid back. My aunt used her share to cover Miranda's medical school costs, and Miranda herself occasionally asked for temporary help with her travel expenses. Nobody questioned where the money came from or how it grew. They assumed it just did. I made sure it did. Through careful investments, patience, and a fair amount of luck, I'd grown the fund into something substantial. But no one ever said thank you. They just assumed I owed it to them. That evening, I got a call from my mother. I didn't answer. She left a message, her voice carrying that familiar tone, half guilt, half superiority. "Alfred, it was just a joke. Don't be so sensitive. You know how your aunt is. Anyway, your father and I were thinking of taking a trip next month, so if you could transfer some money from the fund, we'll send you the details. Love you." I stared at the screen until it went black. I didn't reply. A few days later, my brother showed up at my apartment unannounced. Patrick had always been the kind of person who filled every room he entered, not with warmth, but with noise. He was the oldest, the one who could do no wrong, the one my parents called our hope. He stood in my doorway, wearing that smug half-smile he'd perfected over the years. "Hey, little brother," he said, stepping inside without waiting for permission. "You disappeared after dinner. Everything okay?" "I'm fine," I said. "Just busy." He looked around my place, a modest, neatly kept apartment that I liked for its quiet. His eyes lingered on the framed art on the walls, the minimal furniture, the absence of clutter. "Still living like a monk, huh?" he joked. I didn't respond. He sat down on the couch, sighing dramatically. "Look, Mom and Aunt Muriel think you're mad. You know how they are. They don't mean anything by it. You just gotta grow thicker skin, man." "It's not about that," I said, my voice calm. "It's about respect." Patrick laughed. "Respect? From them? Good luck. They've always been like this. You can't take it personally. Easy for you to say. They treat you like a trophy." "Well, maybe that's because I earned it." The silence after that stretched long enough for him to realize I wasn't going to laugh. He leaned back, unbothered. "Anyway, I came by because I need a favor. A small one." There it was. The real reason. He explained that he was in between contracts and needed a short-term boost from the family fund. He'd already mentioned it to our parents, who apparently told him to talk to me since I handle the technical stuff. "How much?" I asked. He shrugged, too casually. "Just 50,000. I'll pay it back, obviously." I looked at him, at his expensive watch, his tailored jacket, the way he leaned back like the world belonged to him. "You already owe the fund over 200,000, Patrick." He frowned, waving it off. "That's all paperwork. It's family money, not a loan shark deal. It's still supposed to be accounted for." He smirked. "Come on, Alfred. Don't be difficult. You know I'll pay it back. You said that last time." He shifted forward, his tone hardening slightly. "Why are you being like this? It's not your money." I looked at him evenly. "Then why are you here asking me for it?" For a moment, something flickered in his eyes. Annoyance, maybe realization. But he hid it behind a forced laugh. "You've changed, man. You're taking yourself too seriously. Anyway, I'll tell Mom you'll send it." He stood, clapped me on the shoulder, and left. That was the moment I knew things would escalate. The next family gathering came sooner than I expected. My aunt decided to host a casual brunch the following weekend, which in our family meant an opportunity for more thinly veiled competition. I went because I wanted to see, really see, how they'd act now that they'd pushed me past my limits. When I arrived, the usual crowd was there. My parents, Patrick and his wife, my aunt, Miranda, and a few cousins who hovered like spectators. My aunt greeted me with exaggerated warmth. "Alfred, you came. I was afraid we offended you at dinner." "You did," I said simply, which earned me a pause before she laughed it off as if I'd told a joke. "Oh, you're so serious. You need to learn to laugh at yourself, darling." Miranda came over and hugged me briefly. "Ignore them," she whispered, though her tone was more performative than sympathetic. Then, louder, she added, "Uncle Patrick was just telling us how well his new project is going." Patrick grinned, slipping into his favorite topic. He began describing his latest success in detail, which sounded suspiciously like something he'd barely started. Everyone nodded, chimed in, admired. I stayed quiet. At one point, my father turned to me. "So, Alfred, any updates from your—" "What is it again?" "The investment thing." "The firm's doing fine," I said. "That's good," he said distractedly, already turning back to Patrick. The conversation rolled on, each sentence a reminder of where I stood. It wasn't new, but it hit differently now, sharper, colder. My mother occasionally gave me pitying looks, as if I were some lost cause. My aunt filled the room with her laughter. My brother bragged like a politician. Then came the part that sealed it. As the table buzzed with chatter, my aunt suddenly said, "You know, I was thinking, maybe we should have someone else look after the family fund. It's a lot of responsibility for Alfred, and he's got his own little projects." I felt my pulse quicken. Patrick chimed in immediately. "Yeah, It's probably time to bring it back under family supervision. I looked at him. It's been under family supervision. You just don't like accountability. The table went quiet for a second. My mother frowned. Alfred, that's not fair. Patrick's just trying to help. Help? I repeated slowly. By taking control of the one thing I've managed responsibly for nearly a decade? Aunt Muriel interjected with her usual faux sweetness. Oh, don't be defensive. We're just saying maybe you could share the responsibility. You've done your part. Have I? I asked. Because last I checked, I'm the only one who hasn't used that fund like a personal piggy bank. That earned me a few sharp looks, and for the first time, no one laughed. Patrick leaned forward, voice low. Careful, Alfred. Don't forget who you're talking to. I haven't, I said quietly. Miranda tried to diffuse the tension with a nervous giggle. Guys, come on. This is supposed to be brunch, not a board meeting. But the mood had already shifted. The air in the room thickened with unspoken anger. My aunt gave me a tight smile that didn't reach her eyes. You know, Alfred, for someone who's been so quiet all these years, you're suddenly very bold. Maybe I just stopped mistaking silence for respect, I said. No one said anything after that. When I left, I could feel their eyes on my back, suspicious, irritated, maybe even threatened. And deep down, I knew what would come next. The whispering, the phone calls, the subtle attempts to undermine me. They'd start questioning my management of the fund, maybe accuse me of mishandling something. It's what they always did when someone didn't play along. But this time I was ready. I'd already started preparing for it the moment I left that birthday dinner. Quietly, methodically, and as I walked out of that house, hearing their muffled voices behind me, I felt something I hadn't felt in years: control. The game had changed. The following week felt like walking through a storm that hadn't yet hit, but you could feel the pressure building in the air. The calm before it, the silence that hides thunder. That was exactly how it felt. I went about my usual work routine, reviewing reports, handling clients, and keeping the firm running smoothly, but in the back of my mind, I knew something was coming. My family was too predictable. Whenever someone dared to challenge their sense of control, they didn't confront it directly. They schemed. They whispered, twisted facts, and made themselves look like the victims. It didn't take long for the first sign to appear. 3 days after the brunch, I got an email from the bank that handled the family fund. It wasn't alarming at first glance, just a notification that an inquiry had been made on the account. But when I read the details, I froze. Someone had tried to access the account using an outdated authorization code. That shouldn't have been possible unless they had old paperwork. And there was only one person who could have done that: Patrick. He'd handled one transfer years ago when I'd been abroad, and I'd left a single signed authorization with him for emergencies. I canceled it afterward, or at least I thought I had. I called the bank to confirm. The manager, who'd worked with me for years, told me that a family member had come in, claiming to be updating the signatures and permissions for the account, presenting an older document with my name on it. The only reason the bank didn't proceed was because they noticed my signature didn't match the recent digital records. He seemed confident, though, the manager said carefully. He said there'd been a change in management within the family. I felt my chest tighten. Did he say who authorized that change? He said it was a family decision. I thanked him, hung up, and sat there in silence for a long time. A family decision. That phrase could only mean one thing. They'd been talking about me behind my back again, and this time, it wasn't just gossip. They were trying to take control of the fund. That night, my mother called again. Alfred, I just wanted to remind you, your aunt and I talked about moving the family fund into a joint account. It's just for convenience, you know, in case anything happens. We trust you, of course, but it's good to have multiple signatures. There it was. The confirmation I didn't even have to ask for. Whose idea was that? I asked, keeping my voice neutral. Well, she hesitated. Your aunt mentioned it. Patrick agrees it's safer this way. You've been so busy with your business lately, and we wouldn't want you to feel burdened. I could practically hear the fake concern dripping from her voice. So you talked about this without me? Oh, don't be dramatic, she said lightly. We were going to tell you eventually. You don't need to handle everything yourself. I've handled everything myself for 8 years, I said quietly. without a single mistake. Alfred, she sighed, you're taking this too personally. It's just money. Just money. That was the moment something inside me snapped. Not loudly, not violently, but quietly, the way a small crack forms before a structure collapses. My family didn't just take my work for granted. They didn't just disrespect me. They were trying to erase me. I ended the call as calmly as I could, telling her I'd think about it. But the second I hung up, I felt the weight of betrayal sink deep in my chest. Not because of the money itself, but because of what it represented: trust. The one thing I'd still been foolish enough to give them. 2 days later, I got an unexpected visit from Aunt Muriel. She showed up at my office, unannounced and smiling in that overly friendly way that always meant trouble. Alfred, darling, you've been avoiding us. I've been working, I said simply. Well, you must make time for family, she said, walking in as though she owned the place. She looked around, impressed but trying not to show it. My, this is quite the setup. So this is where all the mysterious work happens. I ignored the jab and gestured to a chair. What can I do for you? She sat down, crossing her legs elegantly, hands folded in her lap. I just wanted to have a little chat. You know, between family members. There's been concern about how you're handling the family finances. I felt my jaw tighten. Concern, I repeated. Yes, nothing serious, of course. But you've been so secretive lately, and Patrick mentioned that the bank had some questions. Because he tried to access the account without authorization, I said. Her expression didn't falter. He was only trying to help. You've taken on too much. We all think it's time to share responsibility. We all, I echoed. She smiled sweetly. Your parents, Patrick, myself. Even Miranda agrees. It's nothing against you, dear. We just think it's wiser to have more oversight. I stared at her, the calm in my voice masking the storm beneath. You mean control? She waved a hand dismissively. Oh, don't make it sound so harsh. It's not about control, it's about balance. You've had your turn managing things, and we're grateful, truly. But now that everyone's lives are getting more complicated, it makes sense to, how should I put it, update the system. By taking it from me. Oh, Alfred, she said with a patronizing smile. You're being defensive again. You know, that attitude is exactly why people have trouble including you in things. That line hit hard, not because it was true, but because it was the weapon they always used. Twist isolation into blame. Make you feel like you're the problem for noticing their mistreatment. I leaned back in my chair, studying her. Tell me, Aunt Muriel, when was the last time you even looked at the financial records? She blinked, caught off guard. Well, that's not really my area, right? Because you trust me to handle it. You all trust me to handle it. Until you decide to pretend you don't. Her smile faded slightly. There's no need to get hostile. We're family. Family. That word had lost all meaning to me years ago. I looked her in the eye and said, very calmly, if you, Patrick, or anyone else tries to touch that account again without my consent, I'll freeze every asset tied to it. You can tell them I said that. Her face hardened. Is that a threat? It's a promise, I said quietly. For a moment, she just sat there, studying me as if she couldn't quite believe I'd spoken to her that way. Then she stood up, straightened her jacket, and gave a thin smile. You've changed, Alfred. I hope you know what you're doing. I do, I said. More than you think. She left without another word. That night, the call started. My mother first, demanding to know what I'd said to Muriel. Then Patrick, furious, accusing me of being selfish and paranoid. You don't own that money, he shouted through the phone. It's ours. It's grandfather's legacy, I said. And you've all treated it like a safety net instead of a gift. You think you're better than us? He snapped. Just because you have your little company? You wouldn't even have that if it weren't for the family fund helping you get started. That stopped me. Because he was right, sort of. When I first launched my business, I had borrowed a small amount from the fund, fully documented, fully repaid. The only difference was, unlike them, I'd actually paid it back, with interest. But that didn't matter to him. To them, the fund wasn't about fairness or history, it was about control. And the more I resisted, the more they would try to paint me as the villain. Sure enough, a few days later, my mother called again, her voice trembling with rehearsed emotion. Alfred, I can't believe you'd threaten your aunt like that. She's family. She's only looking out for us. By trying to take something that isn't hers. Don't twist things, she said sharply. You've become impossible to talk to lately. I don't know what's happened to you. I stopped letting you walk all over me, I said quietly. There was a pause on the line, heavy and cold. Then she said, your father and I are disappointed in you. That hurt more than I expected it to. Not because I believe them anymore, but because part of me still wanted their approval, even after all this time. When I hung up, I realized the full weight of what had happened. The people I trusted most had not only betrayed me, they were actively trying to strip me of the one thing I'd worked to protect, both for myself and for the very family now turning against me. It wasn't just disrespect anymore. It was betrayal, calculated and deliberate. And that night, as I stared at the glowing screen of my laptop, watching the numbers of the family fund flicker before me, something inside me shifted completely. I'd always believed that revenge was beneath me, that dignity meant walking away quietly. But dignity doesn't mean silence when silence lets them keep taking. After the betrayal, I went through a period of quiet devastation that nobody saw. The calls, the emails, the passive-aggressive messages, they all blurred together. I couldn't talk to anyone about it because no one outside my family could understand the nuances, the constant undercurrent of entitlement and mockery that had finally escalated into outright betrayal. It was crushing, but oddly clarifying. I had been silent for years, keeping the peace, letting them dominate, let them belittle me. And now, after what happened, I realized peace wasn't an option anymore. Not for me. Not when I had everything I'd worked for hanging in the balance. At first, I tried to reason with them. My father's calls were the hardest to take. He wasn't angry or overtly manipulative, at least not in the way my aunt and Patrick were. He sounded disappointed, pained, even pleading at times. Alfred, you've always been our child, he said. Don't make this harder than it has to be. Just cooperate. We only want what's best for everyone. And I realized in that moment just how little my family actually understood the concept of best. For them, best meant the path of least resistance for themselves. It wasn't about fairness. It wasn't about integrity. It was about who could claim power under the guise of concern. For a week, I lived in a kind of limbo, checking my accounts obsessively, watching their subtle maneuvers, their attempts to get around my authority. Every time I thought about the betrayal, a mix of anger and disbelief surged through me, but I didn't act impulsively. I couldn't. The last thing I wanted was to give them the satisfaction of seeing me unravel. Instead, I poured myself into work, isolating myself from everyone except the few clients who valued me and my advice. That isolation was both painful and productive. I started noticing things I hadn't before: patterns in investments, weaknesses in certain sectors, opportunities for growth in markets my family didn't care about. I began quietly expanding my firm, taking on new clients who paid well and respected me. I created subsidiaries, small but strategic, that allowed me to separate my personal success from the suffocating influence of the family fund. While my family scrambled to assert control over something that wasn't theirs, I was building something undeniably mine. The psychological toll, however, was intense. I would lie awake at night, replaying every slight, every condescending remark, every betrayal. My aunt's smirk at the dinner table, Patrick's arrogance, my mother's faux sympathy, it all merged into a single, inescapable truth. These people had never cared about me, except as a placeholder to maintain the image of a cohesive family. And for the first time, I let myself grieve, not for the fund, not even for my pride, but for the family I had believed I had. That was the rock bottom. But even at rock bottom, clarity emerged. I realized that their power over me existed only because I had allowed it. They assumed my silence was submission. They assumed my loyalty was weakness. They assumed my patience was ignorance. But patience had a limit, and my knowledge gave me leverage they would never see coming. I started small. I meticulously documented every transaction I had made over the past 8 years, every transfer, every repayment, every record showing the growth and management of the family fund. I created a digital archive, backed up and encrypted, with every shred of evidence proving that I had acted in the family's interest while they had mismanaged and abused their access. It took nights of careful work, but it was satisfying in a way I hadn't expected. Each file, each PDF, each signed document a shield and a sword at the same time. Simultaneously, I began cultivating my own assets outside the fund. I had enough personal investments to create a buffer, but I increased them quietly, using knowledge and contacts my family didn't even know I had. I opened offshore accounts, invested in opportunities they would have dismissed, and started building a small but powerful network of allies in the business world who respected competence over name or influence. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, I was regaining the control I had lost. The turning point came when I realized that the family fund, as important as it had seemed, was actually a liability when handled by people like my aunt and brother. They didn't understand accountability. They didn't understand responsibility. They didn't even understand what I had created for them. The very thing I'd devoted myself to protecting was now a weapon in their hands, a weapon they were willing to use against me. And the irony wasn't lost on me. I had grown it, nurtured it, protected it, and they had responded with betrayal. I made a choice then. I would stop giving them the power to hurt me. I would step back, let the fund exist without my immediate oversight, and focus on creating something immune to their manipulation. And as I did, life began to improve. My firm grew steadily, gaining credibility in ways I had never imagined. Clients who once questioned my abilities now sought me out for advice, impressed by the results I quietly delivered. The network I built outside the family proved invaluable, and I began to understand that success didn't require their approval. It required discipline, foresight, and patience. Meanwhile, my family had no idea what was happening. They continued their subtle manipulations, expecting me to react, expecting me to fold, expecting me to beg for reconciliation or validation. They didn't notice that while they were busy squabbling and whispering, I was quietly gaining independence, leverage, and the kind of confidence that can't be shaken by entitlement or mockery. It was strange, this feeling of power that came not from confrontation, but from strategic withdrawal. I watched Patrick struggle to manage his own finances, Miranda complain about loans she couldn't repay, and my aunt fume over trivial administrative details, all while I quietly grew stronger. Every slight, every betrayal, every laugh at my expense became fuel for a strategy one hadn't yet fully articulated, but whose outlines were clear. I would reclaim my dignity, protect what was mine, and show them, calmly and without theatrics, that underestimating me had been a mistake. By the time 3 months had passed, my life had changed in subtle but undeniable ways. I was healthier mentally and emotionally. I exercised regularly to release tension, focusing on long runs and strength training. I cultivated a few close friendships outside the family who provided genuine support. And my firm? It had grown more than I'd expected, gaining visibility in key markets, attracting clients with high net worth, and quietly positioning me as a player my family couldn't even begin to comprehend. And yet, I hadn't acted on the betrayal. Not directly. Not yet. I wasn't out for revenge just for the sake of vengeance. I was building leverage, creating opportunities, and preparing for a moment when my family's assumptions about me would be completely shattered. The calm I had cultivated, the patience, the silence, the quiet expansion, was intentional. I wasn't letting anger dictate my moves. I was letting strategy dictate them. One evening, I sat at my desk reviewing the latest fund reports, sipping tea, and reflecting on the path I had taken. The betrayal still stung. Yes, but the pain had transformed into something else, clarity. I understood who I was, what I was capable of, and exactly what my family believed about me. And the thought that made me smile quietly to myself was this. None of them had a clue that the person they had mocked, belittled, and tried to undermine was quietly growing into someone they could no longer control. Patrick called that night, his tone casual, almost teasing. "Hey, Alfred, you busy? We were thinking of consolidating some accounts. Your aunt and I want to get everything in order before the next family meeting. You'll help, right?" I smiled, though he couldn't see it. "I'll think about it," I said. "Think about it," he laughed. "Come on, Don't be difficult. You know we're just trying to help." "Of course," I said softly. "I know you only have my best interests at heart." He didn't understand the calm beneath my voice, the steel that had formed over months of planning and quiet work. He didn't know that while he assumed I was still the same Alfred he'd always dismissed, I was no longer just his little brother, the quiet one at the table, the one who laughed at their jokes and let them walk all over him. Over the next few months, I continued to build my personal empire quietly, keeping the fund at arm's length while making moves that my family wouldn't even suspect. I realized that the key to real revenge wasn't about confrontation, it was about leverage. The more detached I became from the fund, the more I could observe their weaknesses without interference. They were careless, overconfident, and greedy, and those traits were about to become my greatest assets. It started with small observations. Patrick had no real understanding of investments outside of the few businesses he liked to brag about. He treated every deal like a game he had already won, blindly assuming that risk was someone else's problem. Miranda, brilliant as she was in her medical field, had zero interest in finance and trusted her mother to handle anything remotely monetary. My aunt, meanwhile, loved appearances more than substance. She had influence, but no real strategy. And my parents? They were always reactive, never proactive, and afraid to confront anyone with logic if it challenged their ego. I could work with that. I also realized I had underestimated myself. While they assumed I was quiet and harmless, my business connections had expanded. A few months earlier, I'd been invited to join a private investors forum, a sort of exclusive club where high-net-worth individuals, legal advisors, and fund managers discussed opportunities, mergers, and acquisitions that weren't public knowledge. Nobody in my family had the intellect, reputation, or discretion to be part of something like this. Yet there I was, quietly learning about tax structures, investment loopholes, and asset protection strategies that the average person would never encounter. One evening, as I reviewed notes from a session about family trusts and power of attorney nuances, a realization hit me like a bolt of lightning. Most wealthy families, even those who appeared cohesive, had vulnerabilities. A single signature here, a single misstep there, and an entire fund could be transferred, redirected, or frozen, legally, ethically, and irrevocably. I had been managing their fund properly for years, but they had no idea that the law could protect my position while simultaneously giving me control if used strategically. I had overlooked one simple truth. I had all the expertise they lacked, and with a few calculated moves, I could make the fund untouchable, or mine entirely. It didn't happen overnight. I started by reviewing every document the family had ever signed regarding the fund: authorization forms, beneficiary papers, meeting notes, and correspondence. Each page revealed patterns of negligence, assumptions, and outdated approvals. The more I studied, the clearer it became. My aunt had overstepped on more than one occasion. Patrick had attempted transfers without legal support, and my parents hadn't actually read anything in years. They simply rubber-stamped everything. I documented everything meticulously, building a database of proof. Every mistake, every unauthorized action, every oversight was now recorded, time-stamped, and cross-referenced. Then came the power move. I decided to expand my influence within the financial world, quietly positioning myself as the authority my family would be forced to recognize. I began advising select clients on high-profile mergers, earning recognition and establishing a reputation beyond what they could even imagine. I made strategic introductions, built alliances with law firms specializing in family trusts, and gained access to insider strategies that could protect assets and maximize leverage legally. Simultaneously, I studied their behavior. Every time they tried to assert control over the fund, I noted the exact moments they overstepped, their phrasing, their timing, and their assumptions about my reactions. They thought I was naive or timid. In reality, I was studying them like a chessboard, anticipating moves, predicting overreactions, and understanding the emotional triggers that drove their greed and arrogance. One particular discovery changed the game entirely. While going through the paperwork, I noticed that a clause in the original trust documents had never been updated. It allowed a fund manager to temporarily suspend access in the event of suspected mismanagement. It was written in vague, broad language, but legally binding if handled correctly. That clause had never been used, not even when Patrick tried unauthorized withdrawals, because no one had taken the time to understand its implications. That meant I had the legal right to restrict access, freeze assets, or redirect distributions, all without immediate challenge, as long as I documented the reasoning properly. My excitement wasn't reckless, it was measured. I realized that the clause didn't just protect me. It put me in a position of undeniable authority. I could act legally, ethically, and decisively, while my family scrambled, confused and frustrated. In other words, I could orchestrate the exact payoff I had imagined after years of being underestimated, laughed at, and disrespected. I also discovered another vulnerability. Patrick's constant borrowing had left digital footprints across multiple accounts, some of which weren't legally tied to him, but tied indirectly through family businesses and loans. If I timed it right, these small cracks could escalate into major leverage points. The idea wasn't to ruin anyone completely. It was to reclaim control, assert authority, and make it clear that I was not the person to be underestimated. By the end of that month, I had a plan forming, though I didn't act yet. The foundation was solid. I had legal power, a growing independent empire, documented proof of every misstep by my family, and financial knowledge they couldn't touch. Meanwhile, my life outside the family improved remarkably. I was less stressed, sleeping better, and feeling genuinely proud of my accomplishments. The contrast was intoxicating. I could see them struggling in their entitlement while I thrived quietly, methodically, deliberately. Every interaction with them became a study. Patrick still tried to charm me with casual mentions of the fund. Miranda asked for advice under the guise of concern, and my aunt continued her subtle manipulations. None of it reached me emotionally anymore. I had built emotional armor stronger than their combined mockery. I didn't need to argue. I only needed to wait and act with precision. The key realization settled in one quiet evening, as I reviewed the latest fund report while sipping a single cup of black coffee. I had risen from the place where I felt powerless. I had survived the betrayal, endured the constant manipulation, and learned everything I needed to turn the tables. The fund, which had been their playground, would now become my instrument. And when the time came, I would no longer be the quiet, overlooked brother at the table. I would be the one holding the cards. Patience became my ally, preparation my weapon. I wasn't seeking confrontation for its own sake. I was waiting for the perfect moment to assert power legally, ethically, and irrevocably. And as I closed my laptop that night, I felt a sense of calm satisfaction I hadn't experienced in years. They believed I was still beneath them, still naive, still the mysterious Alfred who didn't understand the world. The plan I'd been building for months finally moved from paper into action, and it was almost boring how calmly I did it. That was part of the point. Let them expect melodrama and give them something sterile, surgical, and irreversible instead. I told myself over and over that this wasn't about cruelty. It was about accountability. It was about making sure the people who'd treated stewardship like a buffet couldn't keep eating at someone else's expense. Step 1 was simple and strictly legal. I invoked the clause in the original trust documents that allowed the fund manager to temporarily suspend access in cases of suspected mismanagement. I had documented, to the letter, Patrick's unauthorized attempts, Aunt Muriel's overreaching suggestions, and multiple verbal admissions from family members that they considered the fund an entitlement rather than a responsibility. Everything I needed to justify a suspension was already in my archive. I drafted the suspension notice in the early hours, precise and dry. No flourish, no lectures, and emailed it to the bank, the fund's custodian, and my family's attorney. I copied the independent audit firm I'd prearranged weeks earlier under the guise of routine consultation. That firm was discreet, competent, and already briefed on the kind of forensic review I wanted. Two things happened almost at once. The bank acknowledged receipt and, as a cautious institution protecting its legal exposure, immediately froze any outgoing transfers pending audit. The custodian issued a formal hold on distributions. The audit firm opened a case and requested full transaction histories for the past decade. The chain of custody on every dollar suddenly required documentation, explanation, and signatures that many people in my family couldn't produce. I anticipated the flurry of calls. They came in the order I'd expected. Patrick first, furious and blustering. My mother worried sounding and pleading. Aunt Muriel contrite, then outraged. Miranda confused and scared. I didn't answer any of them. Instead, I sent one short, polite email. I've temporarily suspended distributions pending an independent review. This is to protect the fund and everyone who depends on it. The auditors will contact you with next steps. Patrick called again, this time more measured because he realized the bank wasn't going to bend. You can't do that, Alf. You don't have the right to lock us out. He was shouting into the void of his own panic. You'll ruin us. I have the legal right to protect the fund. I replied, my voice calm. If you have nothing to hide, this will be resolved quickly. If you do, the auditors will find it. Either way, the decision isn't just mine. It's the fund's protection. Then I executed step 2, the targeted forensic review I'd pushed for revealed patterns I'd quietly expected. Small, frequent transfers disguised as business loans and emergency expenses that led into a web of shell payments and loosely documented advances. Not all of it was criminal on its face. Some of it was sloppy family accounting, the kind your cousins and uncles rationalize away. But there were also clear breaches, transfers made without proper authorization, invoices that traced back to businesses Patrick controlled, and reconciliations that didn't match bank statements. The audit flagged several items for further legal review and notified the bank's compliance department. That triggered a regulatory review, a bureaucratic gear that grinds slow but devastatingly thorough. What I hadn't initially planned, but had hoped for and now relished, was the social collapse. People who depended on the fund's distributions started to panic. Mortgage payments were suddenly at risk. Tuition deadlines moved from abstract to urgent. My aunt called me, voice trembling, trying to wrap grievance, pride, and entitlement into something sympathetic. This is a nightmare, Alfred, she said. How could you do this? You promised to keep things together. I didn't defend myself. I didn't need to. The auditors had done the talking. I sent them the evidence. Emails, the authorization attempt log, Patrick's older signed document showing attempts to update permissions, and watched as the narrative I'd privately curated turned into an institutional finding. The bank, to avoid liability, removed all personal signatory privileges that weren't recently verified and required notarized confirmation for anything that moved out of the account. In plain terms, the family could no longer walk in and take money because they felt entitled. But the real knife was step 3, the wedge I'd positioned months earlier. I'd quietly established an irrevocable holding trust for essential family needs, mortgaged homes, education accounts, and verified medical expenses, funded by a contingency reserve I'd arranged through other legal channels. It wasn't large enough to replace every lifestyle, but it was enough to keep the most vulnerable family members afloat while I let the audit run its course. The messages I sent to the attorney and bank asked them to prioritize verified hardship payments over discretionary distributions. I wanted anyone genuinely in need protected. I didn't want to stop children's tuition or critical bills. I wanted to stop the parties and loans and the belief that the fund was an endless ATM for entitlement. When the bank finally sent the family a formal notice, stark, numbered, and legal, it listed the suspension, the pending audit, and the temporary hardship disbursements. They also included a sentence I drafted with legal counsel. Any individual attempting unauthorized access will be reported to the appropriate regulatory authorities. That line changed the tenor of every whispered conversation in my family's group chat. Faces that once laughed at me now read like people trying to remember whether they'd signed anything in the last decade that looked like a confession. The afternoon the notices went out, the house was an emotional hurricane. My mother sobbed into the phone, alternating blame and apology. Patrick raged, calling me every name he could invent with a legalistic edge. Aunt Muriel demanded a family meeting, the old theater of public virtue and private malice. I agreed to one condition. It would be moderated by the attorney handling the audit, with the bank present and the auditors available to answer questions. The old dinner table where she once cut me down would now have a manila folder with footnotes and exhibits on it. I didn't want theatrics. I wanted procedure. And in the quiet that followed, after the freeze, after the audit engagement, after the first frantic calls, I sat alone and did something small for myself that felt enormous. I deleted the outdated scanned signature file I'd once kept as a convenience. It was symbolic more than functional. The bank had already suspended signatures that weren't verified, but there was a strange satisfaction in removing the physical artifact of their entitlement. It was gone, like a line severed. I hadn't planned on the next twist. Patrick, pushed into a corner, reached for the one thing he assumed gave him leverage, the narrative. He started whispering to cousins, to family friends, to anyone who'd listen, claiming I'd stolen the fund, that I'd gone mad with power. He wanted public outrage. He wanted to turn the story into one where I was the villain. He didn't account for two things: the audit trail I'd archived and the compliance officers I'd quietly briefed in advance. Once the bank's freeze was in place, there was no dramatic theft to accuse me of, only paperwork and documented reason. Regulators moved slowly, but they moved with authority. That night, before the family meeting, I stood at my window and watched the city lights. I felt a strange, quiet detachment. The revenge had been executed not with a shout, but with files, clauses, and patient legal work. I'd predicted their reactions, prepared for the worst, and softened the harm where it mattered. The fund was frozen, the auditors had begun their work, and the family's easy access to what they'd treated as a right had been revoked. But there was a sound I hadn't predicted, the low, human sob of someone who suddenly realizes they've overplayed their hand. It echoed from my phone that evening, a voicemail from Aunt Muriel, voice small for once, asking if we could talk like adults. I listened to it twice, then 3 times. The voice that had once cut me down now sounded raw and uncertain. I sat back down at my desk. On my screen were the audit confirmations, the bank's legal hold, and the first preliminary list of questionable transfers. The mechanics of the revenge had worked perfectly. I protected the vulnerable, halted the entitlement, and forced an institution of greed to account for itself. But something else had shifted in the family dynamic, something I hadn't entirely foreseen. Panic breeds desperation, and desperation can make people dangerous in ways paperwork can't always prevent. My phone buzzed with a single line from Patrick. "This isn't over. You'll pay." I read it, then deleted it without replying. The auditors wanted more documents. The bank wanted more clarification. The family wanted answers they hadn't expected to have to give. I had turned their access into a legal question, and the legal question was slowly, deliciously answering itself. And then, right before the family meeting, right when I thought the next move would be a spreadsheet and a deposition, something happened that made me look up and realize I might have underestimated how far they could go to reclaim what they thought was theirs. The day of the family meeting arrived with a tense quiet that hung over the room like a storm about to break. I arrived early, dressed sharply, my briefcase in hand, carrying only what I needed: the final set of documents, copies of the audit reports, and a calm certainty that this was going to end the way I'd quietly orchestrated. When I walked into the conference room, the expressions on their faces were priceless, a mixture of fury, disbelief, and that familiar undercurrent of entitlement that had always fueled my contempt for them. Patrick tried his usual charm, sliding into the room with a grin, but it faltered the second he saw the bank representatives already seated, auditors at the far end of the table, and my mother's face twisted between shame and panic. Aunt Muriel's hand hovered over her papers like a shield, while Miranda looked nervously at everyone, unsure whether to side with the aggressors or simply remain silent. The meeting began formally, with the auditors reviewing the flagged transactions. I watched quietly as each one of their assumptions, that I had acted recklessly or selfishly, was methodically dismantled. Unauthorized withdrawals, mismanaged loans, and improper documentation were laid out clearly, with dates, signatures, and cross-references. Every single misstep that my family had taken was exposed, without a shred of exaggeration. Patrick squirmed when the auditors noted that several of his emergency transfers were neither authorized nor reconciled. Aunt Muriel flushed red when her interventions were documented as overreach that risked regulatory violations. Even my parents could not hide their discomfort when the auditors calmly explained that their failure to review the fund's statements constituted neglect, leaving them partially liable for financial mismanagement. The room grew quieter with each revelation. Patrick tried to interrupt, to charm, to deflect, but the auditors had prepared for every tactic. The bank representatives confirmed that, due to the irregularities and pending audit, no withdrawals would be authorized without formal, verified documentation. The fund was no longer under the casual control of the family. It had shifted into a legally protected structure I had built months prior, designed specifically to prevent their overreach while safeguarding essential obligations. What how? Patrick stammered, looking at me with a mix of rage and fear. Alfred, you can't just. This isn't fair. Fair, I said, my voice steady. I was fair. I protected the fund, followed the rules, and acted according to the trust's original language. You assumed entitlement was enough to bypass the law. It isn't. Aunt Muriel tried to interject, voice trembling with indignation. You've humiliated us. This is family, Alfred. Family doesn't override responsibility, I replied. You treated this fund as a toy, and now the law has caught up. I protected it for everyone who actually relies on it. The silence that followed was heavier than any argument could have been. My mother's voice cracked as she muttered, I didn't think it would. You didn't think. I finished for her. That's the problem. None of you ever considered accountability until it affected you personally. Now you see why I couldn't let anyone else manage this. By the end of the meeting, the consequences were clear. Patrick was barred from making any financial decisions regarding the fund until a full reconciliation could be completed. Aunt Muriel was reprimanded formally, and her influence over distributions was removed. My parents were forced to acknowledge the gaps in their oversight and the necessity of legal structures to prevent future misuse. Miranda was left shaken but unharmed, a reminder that my action wasn't about vengeance for the sake of cruelty, but about asserting control and teaching accountability. The auditors finalized their report and left the room. The bank representatives confirmed the new structure. The fund was secure, legally insulated, and any future distributions would require documented justification and independent verification. My family had lost their assumed privileges, and the weight of their entitlement had been removed from their hands. I closed the folder in front of me, looking at each of them without anger or malice. This isn't about revenge for revenge's sake, I said. It's about consequences. You treated trust as a joke. Now you see what happens when rules matter more than assumptions. That's the end of it. Patrick opened his mouth, probably to sputter, but no words came. Aunt Muriel sat back, defeated, realizing that charm and theatrics could no longer manipulate reality. My parents were silent, finally understanding that their years of passive approval had enabled disaster. Miranda looked at me, wide-eyed, but I gave her a small nod, the only acknowledgement of her innocence and the only compassion I would extend. As I left the room, I felt a strange weight lift from my shoulders. The fund was secure. The family had learned, in the most unavoidable way, that entitlement has limits, and trust, once broken, has consequences. I didn't shout. I didn't gloat. I simply walked out, calm, composed, and fully in control of what was mine. Later that evening, sitting in my office with the city lights glittering beyond the window, I allowed myself one small smile. It wasn't satisfaction in cruelty or pleasure in seeing them squirm. It was satisfaction in justice. I had been underestimated, dismissed, laughed at, and betrayed. They thought they could walk all over me, manipulate the system, and keep everything as it had always been. They were wrong. And now, finally, the truth was undeniable. The underestimated brother had risen, and there was no coming back from this. The last line I whispered to myself, quiet but full of finality, was simple. I was never the one to underestimate. I'm Frankie, 28, and I've never been big on birthday celebrations. Honestly, I stopped expecting anything meaningful from my family a long time ago. But this year felt different, or at least I wanted it to. It was my first birthday since finally getting my feet under me again after years of struggle. I bought my own house last spring, got promoted to project manager at a small but growing design firm, and for once, I didn't feel like I had to apologize for existing. So when my mom called saying she wanted to host a family dinner for my birthday, I hesitated but agreed. Maybe, just maybe, things could be civil this time. Growing up, my brother Owen was always the center of attention. The charismatic one, as Mom liked to put it, which really meant the one who could do no wrong. He was loud, impulsive, and constantly in some kind of trouble, but Mom always smoothed things over for him. Meanwhile, I was the quiet one, responsible, steady, the one they could count on. Which sounded like a compliment until I realized it just meant they expected me to fix the messes Owen made. And for years, I did. I loaned him money, helped him with rent, even let him crash at my apartment when his ex kicked him out. He always promised to pay me back, but somehow, he never did. Still, I wanted to believe that people change. So I told myself this dinner could be a step toward healing old wounds. Maybe we could sit down, eat a decent meal, and have a normal evening without Owen making everything about him. When I arrived at Mom's house, the first thing I noticed was that she hadn't really gone out of her way. The dining table was cluttered with random papers, a vase of wilted flowers, and half-empty soda bottles. No balloons, no decorations, just a store-bought cake sitting in its plastic container. "Happy birthday, Frankie," Mom said with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. She gave me a quick hug before turning back to stir something on the stove. "I wasn't sure what you like these days, so I just made lasagna. Owen and the kids are coming soon." That familiar sting hit me. She wasn't sure what I liked. I'd lived with her for 20 years. But I forced a smile. "Lasagna's fine. Thanks for cooking." As I set the cake down, I heard her mutter, "Next time, just let me know what kind of cake you want." I almost bought one myself, but I figured you'd want to save money. It wasn't what she said, it was how she said it. That small, offhand remark that carried the weight of judgment. Save money. As if I couldn't afford a cake. I let it slide because that's what I always did. Owen arrived not long after, his voice echoing through the house before he even walked in. "Hey, the birthday kid's here." He was carrying a half-empty six-pack and trailed by his two kids, Eli, 9, and Harper, 7, who immediately began running circles around the table. "Man, you look good, Frankie," he said, clapping me on the shoulder a little too hard. "What's the secret? Finally getting that big paycheck, huh?" I laughed weakly. "Something like that." Mom joined in with a chuckle. "Your brother's just teasing. You know how he is." "Yeah," I said quietly. "I know." Dinner started awkwardly but calm. I tried to engage in small talk, asking the kids about school, complimenting Mom on the lasagna, even laughing politely at Owen's over-the-top stories about his new business venture. He claimed he was flipping cars now, but knowing him, it probably meant he was borrowing money he didn't have again. Things only shifted when it came time for cake. I opened the container, lit a few candles, and smiled as everyone gathered around. Mom handed her phone to Harper to take a picture, but Owen interrupted, saying, "Let Eli do it. He's the man of the house." It was the kind of harmless-sounding comment that used to slide by me, but now it grated. Still, I smiled, blew out the candles, and started cutting slices. I handed Eli the first piece, just trying to keep things light. That's when it happened. He looked down at the cake, wrinkled his nose, and said, "Dad said you're broke anyway." Then, before I could even react, he flipped the plate over, sending the slice splattering across the floor. For a second, the room went silent. I stared at the frosting-covered tiles, my mind blank. Then laughter. Real, full laughter. Owen slapped the table, tears in his eyes from laughing so hard. Mom covered her mouth, but didn't hide her smile. Even Harper giggled. My throat tightened. "That's not funny." "Oh, come on, Frankie," Owen said, still chuckling. "He's just a kid. Don't get so uptight." He's repeating what you told him, I said, trying to steady my voice. Owen leaned back in his chair, grinning. Hey, kids hear things. Don't be so sensitive. We all know you're not exactly rolling in cash. No shame in that. Mom finally chimed in. Owen, that's enough. But she said it softly, with that same indulgent tone she'd always used when he went too far. Like a teacher scolding a student she secretly favored. I looked around the table, my hands trembling. You think this is okay? You think it's funny that your grandson just humiliated me on my birthday? No one met my eyes. That was the moment something in me shifted. I didn't yell. I didn't throw anything or storm out. I just stood up, grabbed my jacket, and said, "Thanks for dinner." Then I left. The air outside was cool, and for the first time in a long while, I felt calm. Not sad, not angry, just done. I drove home in silence, parked in my driveway, and sat in the car for a few minutes, staring at the house I'd worked so hard to buy. The house none of them had ever visited, though they all knew it existed. I remember thinking, they don't even know whose name is on their own roof. 2 hours later, my phone buzzed with a group text from Mom. We've talked it over, and we think it's best to cut ties for now. You've been distant for a while, and tonight proved it. I stared at the screen, reading the words over and over, a strange calm settling over me. Then I typed my reply, just 5 words. Check the deed on the house you live in. And I hit send. What followed that night made me realize that silence can be louder than any argument. The call started almost immediately, first Mom, then Owen. Over and over. By midnight, my phone had 68 missed calls, but I didn't answer a single one. After that night, I didn't hear from them for a week, which, honestly, was a relief. I spent those days working late, taking long walks after dinner, and reminding myself that I didn't owe anyone an explanation. But deep down, the silence felt too deliberate. My family wasn't the type to let things go. They preferred control, and silence was just another way of punishing me. It didn't take long before the quiet cracked. One Saturday morning, I was making coffee when my phone buzzed with a message from Mom. We need to talk about what you said. I didn't reply. I didn't owe them a conversation. But then another message came through. You scared your brother. That was uncalled for. I actually laughed out loud. Scared him? By telling him to check the deed on the house he lived in? If anything, they should have been grateful. But that's not how my family worked. In their world, I was always the problem when I stopped playing along. Later that afternoon, I got a call from an unfamiliar number. Against my better judgment, I answered. It was Owen. Frankie, he said, his voice tight. What did you mean by that text? I sipped my coffee slowly. Exactly what it sounded like. Don't play games, he snapped. You didn't actually mean, look at the paperwork, Owen. There was a pause, long enough that I could hear his shallow breathing on the other end. Then, quieter, you're saying Mom's house is in your name? It's not Mom's house, I said, calm and steady. It's mine. He hung up. For the next 2 days, I didn't hear anything. Then came the explosion. It started with Mom showing up at my house without warning. I was watering the front plants when her car pulled into the driveway, so fast, it almost hit the curb. She got out before the engine even stopped, waving a stack of papers in her hand. What is this, Frankie? She demanded, walking up to me. Why would you put my house in your name? I blinked. Your house. She froze, thrown off by the tone in my voice. I didn't raise it, but the edge was there. Yes, mine. The one I raised you and your brother in. You didn't raise us in it, Mom, I said. You almost lost it 3 years ago when Owen's debt collectors started calling. You remember that, don't you? Her lips pressed into a thin line. I refinanced it under my name. I continued. I've been paying the mortgage ever since. You agreed to it. You signed the paperwork. Her expression flickered with something between guilt and defensiveness. You said it was temporary. I said I'd help you keep the roof over your head. I never said it was temporary. She looked like she wanted to argue, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, she took a shaky breath and said, You didn't have to embarrass us. You could have talked to me privately. What you did, what I did. I cut in. What I did was walk away quietly from a dinner where your grandson dumped my birthday cake on the floor while everyone laughed. What I did was give you years of help while Owen drained every cent I lent him. I've done enough talking, Mom. You just never listened. She stood there in silence, her fingers tightening around the papers until they crinkled. "You've changed," she said finally. "You used to be kinder." "No," I said softly. "I used to be quieter." She didn't reply, just turned, got into her car, and drove away. For a few weeks, things stayed tense but quiet again. I half expected Owen to show up next, maybe to apologize, or more likely, to demand answers. Instead, he started playing his favorite game, Smear by Gossip. It started subtly. A few old friends from our hometown texted me, saying they'd heard I kicked Mom out of her house. Another said Owen told people I was trying to take control of the family property. Every version of the story painted me as cold, greedy, heartless. I shouldn't have been surprised. That was Owen's pattern: create chaos, twist the story, play the victim. Then Mom joined in. I found out she'd been telling her church friends that she was living under her child's ownership and that she never wanted it to be like this. When someone called to ask if she was okay, I knew she'd gotten exactly what she wanted: sympathy. Meanwhile, Owen kept calling. Not to reconcile, of course. No, his calls came at odd hours, each one angrier than the last. "You think you can just take what's not yours?" he said once. "You're going to regret this, Frankie." Family doesn't turn their back on family. The irony almost made me laugh. Family didn't turn their back on family. That's exactly what they'd done at that dinner table. I stopped answering his calls, but his messages piled up. Screenshots of supposed proof that I'd tricked Mom, half-baked threats about taking me to court, voice notes of him yelling about betrayal. Each one felt more desperate. Then, one afternoon, I came home from work and found a small figure sitting on my porch steps. Harper. She was clutching a stuffed bunny and looked up at me with wide eyes. "Daddy told me to give you this," she said, handing me an envelope. Inside was a handwritten letter from Mom. The neat, cursive handwriting I'd seen on birthday cards and shopping lists all my life. It read, "Frankie, you've caused so much pain by doing what you did. I don't understand how you could turn on your own family. Your brother is furious, and I don't know how to calm him down. Please fix this before it gets worse. I raised you better than this." I folded the letter carefully and looked down at Harper, who was watching me with innocent confusion. "Did your dad tell you to wait for me here?" I asked. She nodded. "He said you'd want to talk to him after you read it." I swallowed back the irritation that burned in my chest. "You shouldn't be here alone, sweetheart. Let me drive you home, okay?" The car ride was quiet except for the sound of rain beginning to tap against the windshield. When we pulled into Mom's driveway, Owen came out onto the porch, arms crossed, a smug grin on his face. "See? She found her way just fine," he said. I ignored him. "Next time, don't send your daughter to deliver your messages," I said flatly. He scoffed. "Relax, she was just sitting there for a few minutes. She's a kid, not your errand runner." He shrugged, still smirking. "You really think you're better than the rest of us now, huh? Big house, fancy job, suddenly you're too good for family dinners." "Family dinners?" I said quietly. "That's what this is about. You humiliated me, Owen. You let your kid call me broke, and then you laughed about it." "Oh, come on," he said. "It was a joke. You're really going to throw away your family over a piece of cake." That line, that stupid, dismissive line, it summed up everything about Owen. He could crush someone's dignity and call it just a joke. I turned to leave, but he added, "You know, Mom's been really upset since you pulled this house stunt. You might want to think about that before you lose her for good." I paused, my hand on the car door. "She lost me a long time ago, Owen. You just never noticed." As I drove off, I saw him in the rearview mirror, standing in the rain, still shouting something I couldn't hear. After that, I started getting letters from Mom's friends. Not emails, letters. Neatly written messages asking me to make peace with my family, reminding me that life is short and blood is thicker than water. Some of them even quoted Bible verses about forgiveness. It was painfully clear where they were getting their information from. I ignored them all, but I won't lie, it hurt. It hurt knowing my mother was using strangers to guilt me instead of just owning what she and Owen had done. It hurt realizing she'd rather protect his ego than her relationship with me. Then came the worst blow. About a month later, I got an email from the property management company that handled repairs for the house, my house. It said there had been unapproved renovations done on the property. I was confused until I drove over and saw it. Owen's truck in the driveway, a pile of drywall and tools on the lawn, and Mom standing there like nothing was wrong. "What's going on?" I asked, stepping out of the car. Owen turned from the porch, holding a hammer. "Just fixing the place up. Mom wants to make the dining room bigger." I stared at him. "You're knocking down walls without telling me?" Mom spoke up quickly. "It's my home, Frankie. I should be able to make it comfortable." I took a deep breath, my pulse pounding in my ears. "It's my property, Mom. You can't do that without permission." "You don't own me," she said sharply. "You might have your name on some paper, but that doesn't make you the boss here." That's when I realized it wasn't just denial anymore. It was defiance. She and Owen had decided that if they ignored reality long enough, maybe it would stop being true. It was the following week when I realized my mother and brother weren't just being stubborn. They were actively trying to erase me from the picture. After that day, I found Owen tearing into the dining room wall. I had sent a polite but firm email to both of them, outlining what was and wasn't allowed under the property agreement. I attached photos of the contract, the deed, and even the renovation guidelines, making sure there was no room for confusion. I thought it might cool things down, maybe even make them realize I wasn't playing games. But they didn't respond. Not with an email, not with a call, nothing. It was the kind of silence that comes before a storm. A few days later, I got a letter in the mail. Not from either of them, but from the county office. It said there had been an inquiry regarding the ownership of my property, filed under my mother's name. For a second, I thought it had to be some kind of clerical error. But as I read further, I realized Owen and Mom had tried to transfer the deed back to her name without my consent. They'd actually gone down to the office and submitted fraudulent paperwork. I sat there at my kitchen table, holding the letter with shaking hands. There was anger, yes, but also disbelief. They had actually crossed that line. This wasn't family drama anymore. It was betrayal on a legal level. I drove straight to my lawyer's office. Thankfully, she'd helped me when I refinanced the house, so she still had all the records. She took one look at the documents and sighed. "You're not going to like this," she said, "but you need to prepare yourself. If they're this desperate, it's going to get messy." She wasn't wrong. Within a week, I started hearing things from neighbors around Mom's place. Owen had been telling everyone that I'd stolen the house out from under her, that I'd tricked her into signing something when she was emotionally vulnerable. He'd even started dropping hints that I'd isolated her, painting me as some greedy manipulator who wanted to put his own mother on the street. The thing about lies is, they spread fast when they sound dramatic. By the time I visited Mom again to straighten things out, I could feel the shift. The neighbors wouldn't look at me the same way. One even muttered "shameful" under their breath as I walked past. When Mom opened the door, she looked tired but strangely composed. "Frankie," she said, voice cool. "You didn't have to go this far." "Go this far?" I echoed. "Mom, you and Owen tried to forge a legal document. Do you even understand how serious that is?" She frowned, arms crossing defensively. "We didn't forge anything. We corrected it. The house was never supposed to be yours forever." My stomach dropped. "So you did do it." She looked away, her silence confirming everything. "Why?" I asked, my voice breaking a little. "Why would you do that after everything I've done for you?" "I saved this house, Mom. I kept it from being taken away. I paid the bills you and Owen ignored." She sighed heavily, like she was the one being wronged. "You're making this all about you again. You think money gives you the right to lord it over us? You've been acting superior ever since you got that promotion. This house, it was never meant to be your way of controlling us." "Controlling you?" I said. "You were days away from losing it. I didn't take anything from you. I kept it from being gone forever." Owen's voice came from the living room. "You could have just signed it back when we asked." I turned to see him lounging on the couch like this was all a game. "You're unbelievable," I said. "You really think you can lie your way out of this?" He smirked. "I think people believe what they want to believe. And right now, everyone's seeing you for what you really are, a selfish little control freak who can't stand not being the hero." I clenched my fists, but I didn't respond. I couldn't trust myself to speak without shouting. I just turned to Mom and said, "You're letting him drag you down with him." Her face hardened. He's my son. So am I said quietly. That was the last thing I managed before I walked out. That night, I sat on my couch for hours, staring at my phone as the notifications poured in. Facebook posts, comments from mutual acquaintances, even texts from extended family members I hadn't spoken to in years. They all said variations of the same thing. How could you do that to your own mother? It felt surreal. My own mother and brother were rewriting the story of my life, and people were believing it. The next morning, I found out they'd done something even worse. Owen had gone to my workplace. He showed up unannounced, claiming to be there to sort out a family emergency. One of my coworkers texted me before I arrived. "Hey, is everything okay? Your brother's here. Says it's urgent." By the time I got there, Owen was sitting in the lobby, charming the receptionist like he always did, loud, confident, overly friendly. The moment he saw me, his expression changed. "Frankie," he said, standing. "You've been ignoring me. Not cool." I motioned for him to follow me outside before he made a scene. Once we were out of earshot, I said, "You had no right to come here." He shrugged. "You weren't answering your phone. Figured I'd stop by. You're not so busy that you can't talk to your own family." I took a deep breath. "If this is about the house again, it's always about the house," he interrupted, his tone sharp now. "You think you can humiliate us and walk away? Mom's been sick over this." "Sick because you've been feeding her lies," I shot back. He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "You don't get it, do you? She believes me. Everyone does. You might own the house on paper, but in everyone else's eyes, you're the villain now. And that's not a reputation you shake easily." That line hit harder than I expected. Because deep down, I knew he wasn't wrong. My mother had always been the community sweetheart, the one who baked cookies for fundraisers, who volunteered at church, who everyone adored. If she said something, people believed it. I felt my control slipping, but I refused to give him the satisfaction. "You should leave," I said firmly, "before I call security." He smirked. "Go ahead. Let's see how your boss feels about family drama spilling into his office." And that's when it hit me. He didn't just come to guilt me. He came to embarrass me, to make me look unprofessional, unstable. He wanted me to lose everything, just like he always did when he couldn't get his way. I didn't take the bait. I went inside, told the receptionist to call security, and watched as they escorted him out. He didn't resist. He just smiled at me through the glass doors as he left, mouthing, "You'll regret this." By the time I sat back at my desk, my hands were shaking so badly I could barely type. That night, I got another message, this time from an unknown number. It was a photo of my mother standing in front of the house, crying, with the caption, "How could you do this to her?" Then another, a picture of a for sale sign that Owen had apparently stuck in the front yard as some kind of cruel joke. I drove there immediately, my heart pounding the whole way. When I pulled up, the sign was still there, tilted slightly in the dirt. Mom stood on the porch, looking small and tired, and Owen was leaning against his truck, arms crossed. I got out, grabbed the sign, and yanked it from the ground. "What is this supposed to be?" I demanded. Owen grinned. "Just seeing how it looks. You know, for when you sell our house." Mom said nothing. She just stood there, eyes red, lips pressed tight. "Did you let him do this?" I asked her. Her silence said enough. I threw the sign into the back of my car. "This is harassment," I said, my voice shaking. "You've crossed every line, Owen. I'm done protecting you. If you set foot on this property again, I'll involve the police." For a second, his smirk faltered, replaced by something colder. "You wouldn't dare. Try me." As I drove away, I saw him in the rearview mirror again, standing beside Mom, who didn't even look at me. She didn't try to stop him, didn't defend me, didn't say a single word. That was the night the weight of everything hit me all at once. Years of covering for Owen, of helping Mom, of pretending their cruelty was just family teasing. It wasn't. It never was. It was control disguised as love. The next few weeks were brutal. I won't sugarcoat it. Emotionally, it felt like being caught in a storm without an umbrella. I couldn't trust Mom. I couldn't trust Owen. And for the first time in years, I couldn't trust that anyone in my life had my back. Messages, calls, rumors, and passive-aggressive letters kept piling up. Every time I turned around, Someone new had somehow heard about how I treated my mother, and it felt like the whole world was ganging up on me. I remember sitting on my couch one night, staring at my phone, and thinking, maybe I'm better off with no one. I had friends, sure, but they lived their own lives. They weren't tangled in the family mess. Even so, the loneliness was sharp. I'd grown up thinking family was supposed to protect you, support you, at least love you unconditionally. Instead, I was the villain in my own story. The first time I really felt the weight of it was when I went out for groceries. I ran into a neighbor I'd known since childhood. "Frankie," she said cheerfully. "I just heard, She hesitated, biting her lip. I could see her trying to decide how to say the words without offending anyone. "About your mom?" I forced a smile. "She's fine," I said, sliding past her. But inside, a mix of frustration and disbelief churned. The woman I'd babysat as a kid, the woman I'd brought cookies to when she was sick, she didn't know the truth. She didn't know that Mom and Owen were orchestrating lies about me behind the curtain. I started spending more time at the house, not as a guest, but as someone reclaiming space I'd earned. I fixed the landscaping, repainted the fence, and even rearranged the garden beds in ways I'd been meaning to for months. Each small project was therapeutic, a quiet reminder that I was in control of something, even if the rest of my life felt chaotic. Work became my sanctuary. I threw myself into projects, staying late at the office and volunteering for high-profile clients. Every success I achieved, there was like a silent middle finger to the chaos my family had created. I could feel myself growing, not in arrogance, but in certainty. I wasn't powerless. I could build, protect, and thrive. And thrive I did. I landed a major client for the firm, a small chain of boutique hotels looking for a complete brand overhaul. The project was challenging, demanding every ounce of creativity and organization I had. But by the time it launched, the client was ecstatic, the firm was buzzing about the work, and I was offered a promotion I hadn't even asked for. For the first time, my professional life mirrored the independence I'd carved out in my personal life. Meanwhile, I was quietly setting boundaries at home. I stopped answering calls from Mom and Owen. I deleted their messages without reading them. I refused to engage in gossip or debates with neighbors. Every interaction that had the potential to stir drama was carefully avoided. At first, it felt lonely, but over time, the weight lifted. I started noticing the freedom that came with cutting out toxic noise. The real turning point came about 2 months after the cake incident. I received a call from an old mentor of mine, someone I hadn't spoken to in years. He'd seen my work in a recent industry showcase and wanted to collaborate on a larger-scale project, one that could potentially double my income and put me in the spotlight in ways I'd never dreamed of. We met at a coffee shop, and as we talked about design philosophies, business growth, and long-term goals, I realized something incredible. My life was finally mine. For so long, I had been defined by Mom and Owen's needs, their whims, and their manipulations. Now, I was defining myself. Around the same time, I started taking my own security seriously. Cameras went up at my property. Locks were changed. A legal retainer ensured that if either of them tried another stunt, I could respond immediately. I wasn't paranoid. I was prepared. And with each small measure of protection, I felt my confidence grow. Even socially, I was starting to reclaim my world. I reconnected with friends I'd lost touch with over the years, people who respected me without judgment. I took weekend trips, explored new hobbies, and even started volunteering at a local art program, mentoring teens who reminded me of myself at that age, cautious, careful, often overlooked. It felt good to be in control of how I gave my energy instead of constantly defending against manipulation. Then came the day I realized just how far I'd come. I was hosting a casual dinner at my house, just a few friends, nothing extravagant. Owen had texted me, predictably, trying to provoke me. "Hope you're not getting too big for your britches, Frankie." I ignored it. That night, as I watched my friends laugh around the table, as I poured wine and passed dishes I'd cooked myself, I felt something I hadn't felt in years: pride. Genuine, quiet pride. Not long after, I got a call from a developer who wanted to partner with me on a creative renovation project. The deal was lucrative, but more importantly, It positioned me in a space of influence I'd never had before. I began to see a future where I wasn't just defending against my family's antics, but actively building a life that made me untouchable. At the same time, Mom and Owen continued to spiral in their own bubble. I heard through the grapevine that Owen had started borrowing money from friends, claiming it was for family emergencies, while neglecting bills he'd promised to pay months ago. Mom, for her part, had started telling anyone who would listen that she just couldn't reach Frankie anymore, and that he changed since the house thing. But in reality, I had changed, but in the best way possible. I'd stopped needing their validation, stopped letting their words wound me, and instead funneled that energy into growing stronger. I began documenting everything: emails, texts, phone calls, even snippets of conversations with neighbors who were now starting to question Owen's stories. I wasn't planning revenge yet, at least not consciously, but I was quietly collecting pieces. Each piece a puzzle, each puzzle a potential way to finally, fully demonstrate the truth. I also started noticing patterns in their behavior. Every lie, every manipulation, every act of humiliation was predictable. Mom's guilt tripping, Owen's gaslighting, the way they tried to pull in outsiders to validate their story, it all had a rhythm. And with that rhythm, I started to see the possibilities. Not impulsive revenge, not petty retaliation, but strategic, controlled, undeniable actions that would finally flip the script. Life outside their influence was starting to feel richer, sharper, and more mine. I found myself smiling more often. I laughed without restraint. And yet, beneath that calm, a quiet, simmering thought lingered. They had underestimated me every single time. They thought that owning the narrative, twisting facts, and controlling appearances would keep me in line. They had no idea how capable I was of building my own empire quietly, steadily, without them even noticing, until the moment it counted. I started investing more intelligently, leveraging opportunities I'd never considered when I was too busy cleaning up their messes. I quietly bought shares in a small design startup that was struggling but had incredible potential. I negotiated new contracts that doubled my earnings. I even started a small side business for freelance design work, which quickly took off thanks to my expanding network. By the time Owen tried to warn me again, by showing up unannounced at my property or texting veiled threats, I didn't flinch. I had all the tools I needed: financial stability, legal backing, a supportive network, and the quiet knowledge that every step I had taken in the last few months had been deliberate. I wasn't just surviving. I was rising. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, the power dynamic began to shift. I started walking into social situations differently. People who had once taken Owen or Mom at their word were beginning to notice discrepancies in the story. Small questions, curious glances, casual comments. They all chipped away at the narrative they had built. And I noticed how effective it was just to stay calm, let them flounder in their own lies, while I steadily improved my position. I began to fantasize, not about petty vengeance, not about shouting matches, but about moments of quiet, undeniable triumph. A way to reveal everything they'd done, all the lies, all the manipulation, without me ever stooping to their level. By the time my birthday rolled around again, quiet, celebrated only with close friends and laughter, Frankie, who had spent years being humiliated, ignored, and belittled, had finally arrived. He was confident, unshakable, and most importantly, ready, not for confrontation yet, but for the moment when the scales would finally tip in his favor. By the time summer rolled around, I was no longer the reactive Frankie who had stormed out of that birthday dinner months ago. I was calculated, methodical, and quietly powerful, and I had the receipts to prove it. Every interaction with Mom and Owen had been a lesson, each insult and every attempt to undermine me a brick in a foundation I was carefully building. What I needed now was leverage, something they couldn't ignore, something that would make them realize they couldn't just laugh at me or gaslight their way around the truth. The opportunity came in the form of a local real estate seminar. I'd been casually following the market, watching how properties changed hands, and how ownership could be manipulated if you weren't paying attention. It wasn't something I ever wanted to exploit personally, But after the cake incident and the attempted deed transfer, I realized knowledge was power. So I signed up, almost on a whim, thinking it might be interesting and maybe useful down the road. The seminar turned out to be a goldmine. Not only did it cover legal protections for property owners, but it also included modules on trusts, asset protection, and the kind of loopholes that allowed people to protect assets from overreaching relatives or unscrupulous family members. I listened intently, taking notes, and asked every question I could think of. The more I learned, the more I realized how exposed Mom and Owen had left themselves, and conversely, how secure I could make myself. By the end of the weekend, I had a plan forming. Nothing impulsive, nothing that could backfire. Just careful steps, each one designed to put me in a position where I controlled the narrative, the assets, and, most importantly, the upper hand in any future confrontations. I started by tightening security around the house, legally and physically. I updated insurance, installed cameras, and set up a trust that made it nearly impossible for anyone to interfere with my ownership. I even went so far as to speak with my lawyer about ways to document past interactions, threats, and attempts to manipulate the deed. Each meeting left me more confident. I was no longer just defending my property. I was safeguarding my life from the chaos they tried to inject into it. Work continued to flourish. That boutique hotel chain I'd partnered with brought me more clients than I could have anticipated, and suddenly, I had influence in circles I never thought I'd access. Local business owners, investors, and community leaders began to know me as a professional capable of handling high-stakes projects with grace and precision. I didn't flaunt it, there was no need. But quietly, I realized that my reach extended beyond the neighborhood gossip that Owen relied on to tarnish my reputation. The real turning point came when one of my clients, a well-known property developer, mentioned they were looking for someone to consult on a large estate that had a complicated family ownership situation. They needed someone who could untangle legal documents, navigate disputes, and understand interpersonal family conflicts. I immediately recognized the opportunity. This was the perfect way to refine my skills, to position myself as someone who could command authority in situations similar to what I'd been through. And perhaps, if leveraged carefully, something I could use with my own family. I pitched myself, carefully emphasizing my experience with property management, design, and conflict resolution. Within days, I was offered a consulting role, and the project was massive. It required precision, diplomacy, and a keen understanding of human behavior. I threw myself into it, knowing that each success here would increase my credibility, and more importantly, give me tools to protect and, if necessary, assert myself against Owen and Mom. Meanwhile, I kept tabs on them from a distance. I didn't answer messages or calls, but I watched quietly. Every attempt to manipulate neighbors, every story they spread, only reaffirmed how desperate they were to maintain control. I started documenting patterns, saving screenshots, taking note of dates, times, and witnesses. Each act of entitlement or dishonesty became another piece in a puzzle that I was quietly assembling, like a blueprint for the moment when they could no longer deny reality. I also began networking strategically. I reached out to lawyers, financial advisors, and even a couple of business mentors who had experience with family-owned properties and legal disputes. These relationships weren't casual. They were connections I could call upon if the need ever arose. I was quietly creating a web of resources that made me untouchable. But it wasn't just about protection. It was about opportunity. While Owen and Mom continued to spiral in their bubble of entitlement, I was quietly positioning myself to turn the tables. I understood their weaknesses now. Owen's arrogance, Mom's desire for public sympathy, and their shared reliance on gossip and perception over reality. If I moved carefully, I could make them pay for every insult, every lie, every attempt to humiliate me. And unlike them, I wouldn't need to raise my voice or throw a tantrum. I could do it through preparation, influence, and undeniable proof. One afternoon, while reviewing documents for the estate project, it hit me. The same principles I was using to help this client could be applied to my own situation. The right legal moves, the careful documentation, and the strategic positioning could ensure that Owen and Mom would never be able to undermine me again. not without consequences they couldn't ignore. That evening, I sat on my porch, looking out at my yard, the house I'd fought so hard to protect finally feeling like a true sanctuary. I wasn't just surviving anymore, I was thriving. My finances were secure, my reputation growing, and my understanding of law and property stronger than either of them could have anticipated. For the first time, I felt a sense of calm certainty. The next steps weren't about reaction, they were about execution. I didn't need to respond to their calls or letters immediately. I didn't need to argue or plead. I had built power quietly, methodically, and I knew that when the moment came, I could reveal it in a way that would leave no doubt about who had been wronged. Owen and Mom had thought they could humiliate me, scare me, and manipulate me. They didn't know that I was already 3 moves ahead, quietly plotting a way to reclaim control and ensure that their attempts to control me backfired spectacularly. I went to bed that night with a strange sense of satisfaction. Not joy, not anger, but focus. I had risen from the chaos, and now I held the pieces to a game they couldn't possibly anticipate. And when the time came, I would play that game and win. If you told me a year ago that I'd be the calm one in a room that would bring my whole family to their knees, I wouldn't have believed you. But that's exactly how it felt the day I set the plan in motion, quiet, precise, and utterly unhurried. I'd spent months collecting the pieces, timestamps from the security cameras I'd installed, the footage of Owen hauling that for sale sign and of him and his crew starting the drywall, the county letter that proved someone had filed a fake transfer, contractor invoices showing work done without authorization, screenshots of the rumors Owen had ceded to neighbors, copies of the forged documents themselves, and a stack of emails where Mom had acknowledged my help with bills and the refinance. I also had professional allies quietly lined up. My lawyer, the county clerk who handled property records, who'd agreed to review the paperwork with me, and a developer client who owed me a favor and who was respected in the community. Nothing dramatic, no shouting, no theatrics, just an airtight folder that told the truth in black and white. I scheduled a neighborhood meeting at the community center a week in advance. The flyer I posted didn't hint at anything personal. It said only that there would be a discussion about property scams and homeowner rights, and that the county would have a representative present. Word spread, and on the evening of the meeting the room filled with folks who knew Mom and Owen. People who had been primed by years of their charisma and little half-truths. I sat in the back, my hands folded, watching the room warm to the county officials' dry, careful explanations about deed transfers and how fraud usually happens. I listened to neighbors' questions and saw their faces go thoughtful, then skeptical. That was when I felt the small, cold thrill that comes right before the scales tip. When the Q&A waned, I stood up. I didn't raise my voice. I introduced myself simply. Frankie, homeowner, contractor on local projects, someone who'd seen his fair share of paperwork. I said I wanted to share an example, purely educational, of how bad actors can manipulate records and public perception. My lawyer and the county clerk sat beside me. My developer friend sat behind me. I pulled out the folder. I laid the forged transfer forms on the table, the timeline of emails that showed Mom's understanding of the refinance, the camera stills of Owen placing the sign, the invoices for drywall work with his name on them, and the county letter of inquiry. I played 2 short clips from my security camera, one of Owen's truck pulling into the driveway at an odd hour, and another of the for sale sign being planted. I didn't call anyone a liar. I didn't spout revenge rhetoric. I let the evidence speak. People leaned in. The room's warmth went cold and clinical. The county official explained, in calm terms, how the forged submission had been flagged and how the signature differed from Mom's usual notarized documents. My lawyer outlined the remedies and the criminal consequences of forging public records. The developer, because he knew Owen from local work bids, spoke up about how reckless Owen's behavior was for the neighborhood and how many people had contracts now in limbo because of sloppy, unauthorized renovations. Neighbors' faces shifted from sympathy to shock too. In some cases, anger. I watched Mom in the third row, hands clenched, mouth working. Owen's jaw tightened until it turned white. When I finished, I said one thing that felt both merciful and final. If anyone here helped spread rumors about me without knowing the facts, I'm willing to talk privately. But if anyone helped fabricate documents or tamper with property records, you're looking at serious consequences. I brought these documents because I want the truth to be public, not gossip, not half-stories. Just the truth. I didn't enjoy the attention. I didn't need it. But I did feel it. The room's atmosphere changing from uncertain to focused, like a tide shifting. The first audible reaction came from the back. Pastor Murray, someone Mom had confided in for years, stood up slowly and asked a pointed question about the timeline. He looked at Mom and Owen and then at the county official. "How could we have missed this?" he asked aloud. The county clerk gently explained how the paperwork had been submitted and how it was flagged for further review. Basically, that without actual fingerprints and direct notarization, a transfer wouldn't hold up, but the attempt alone had sowed confusion. A woman who'd been on the neighborhood association board whispered, "We should have checked with the county ourselves." Murmurs rippled like a wave. People I'd assumed were lost to their narrative were suddenly taking notes and asking for copies of the documents. Owen blurted out something, a half-hearted, defensive attempt to minimize, and immediately looked ridiculous. He tried to charm, to pivot, and it didn't work. The developer friend leaned forward and, in a quiet voice that carried, said, "Whatever your reasons, Owen, this is not how responsible people behave. You could have asked Frankie. You could have called the right offices. Instead, you tried to fix things behind the scenes and made it worse for everyone." That line landed like a soft but decisive blow. The room's attention snapped to him. I watched the color drain from Owen's face as neighbors' eyes hardened in ways they hadn't before. That was when the private texts started to leak. Screenshots of Owen pushing for signatures. Messages he'd sent to contractors promising payment he never made. A voicemail he'd left one of Mom's church friends sobbing about my family being taken from me. It was messy and human and undeniable. One by one, people I'd feared were lost to their charm shifted sides. Not with fanfare, but the quiet gravity of people realizing they'd been misled. I didn't gloat. There was no flourish. I simply sat there and breathed, feeling the careful work of months finally reflect back at me in the shape of truth. Then Mom stood. Her hands trembled. She had been so sure the room would help her. She had practiced the lines about being taken advantage of, about my son being mean, about the poor woman who needed her home. But the stack of facts on the table dismantled those rehearsed sentences like a breeze through a stack of paper. Her voice cracked when she tried to speak. For a moment, she looked like someone trying to remember a life that had splintered into versions she no longer recognized. Owen reached for his phone. I saw him aimlessly swipe, maybe to record, maybe to call for backup. He looked up at me, and there was an animal regret in his eyes that made the room go still. People were watching him now not as the funny, loud uncle, but as someone who'd gambled the neighborhood's trust for ego. He made a move, like he might storm the table, like he might shout something to reclaim the story. He didn't. Instead, he sat, hands flat on his knees, face draining color. And then, right when the room felt like it might exhale, when the current had begun to carry the truth through the crowd, the meeting door opened. Mom's phone vibrated on the table beside her. A dozen missed calls, a string of texts. She glanced at it, then up at Owen, who was staring at me like I'd ruined him. The cell buzzed again. Someone in the front row gasped softly. Pastor Murray said, "Frankie, whoever you are, thank you for bringing this. We needed to know." People were already forming little knots of conversation, some calling others to tell them the truth, some simply shaking their heads in disbelief. And then, before I could say anything else, Owen's phone lit up with an incoming call labeled Mom. He answered. I don't remember the first words, only the way his shoulders hunched, the way his voice lost its bravado. He said something that made Mom flinch, and a hush fell over the room. That was the moment the air changed from vindication to something more complicated. I could see the gears turning in Owen's face as he listened, the panic that flickered then hardened into a new kind of calculation. I was ready for fallout. I expected denial, anger, maybe even threats. What I didn't expect was the exact thing Owen did next, the move that would either finish them for good or force me into a choice I hadn't fully planned for. He lowered the phone, looked at Mom, then at me, and mouthed words I couldn't quite catch. People leaned forward. My lawyer's hand found mine under the table. The county clerk closed his folder and said nothing. Everyone waited. And then Owen did something I hadn't anticipated at all. He stood up slowly, and the sound of his chair scraping the floor felt like the click of a lock. Owen's slow rise from his chair felt theatrical, but the confidence it projected was fake. I had seen that arrogance before, always overcompensation for insecurity, but tonight, it wouldn't work. The room was still, every eye on him, waiting for some dramatic denial or excuse. What came out of his mouth instead made the tension snap like a taut wire. I guess we underestimated Frankie. Owen stammered, voice cracking. Mom, I didn't mean. He trailed off, completely unconvincing. He looked around, realizing the neighbors, the pastor, the developer, even the county clerk were all watching him with hard, skeptical eyes. Every witness who had once smiled at his charm now regarded him as what he was, a liar, a manipulator, and someone who had finally been caught. Mom tried to intervene. Frankie, don't listen to him, she said, voice shaking. But her words rang hollow. The evidence was on the table, hundreds of pages, photos, emails, even video. No amount of pleading could rewrite that reality. Even she could see it. The murmurs started small, like a ripple through the crowd, then grew louder. People started talking quietly to one another, pointing to documents, whispering, shaking their heads. A neighbor muttered, "All this time, I thought it was Frankie being difficult. Now, it's clear who's been manipulating everyone." Another added, "That deed, that's serious. They could have gone to jail." The realization spread like wildfire. Owen's face turned red, then pale, then flushed again with panic. He tried to pivot, to claim it had been a misunderstanding, but the words faltered. Every lie he tried to tell now collided with proof, time-stamped evidence, and multiple witnesses. He was trapped. And then came the quietest but most devastating blow. The local news reporter who had been covering community affairs for months, attending because of the flyer I'd posted, leaned forward. "Owen, your attempt to manipulate public records is a crime," he said calmly. "And your neighbors have documented your actions. This story will go beyond this room if it hasn't already. Legal action is inevitable." Owen swallowed hard, his jaw tight. For the first time, he looked small, not the loud, entitled family villain I'd endured for years, but a boy who had finally realized how deeply he'd underestimated me. Mom sank into her chair, her hands covering her face. I didn't," she whispered, but even she knew the words didn't absolve her. Her reputation, carefully cultivated over decades, was crumbling. Her friends and church associates were now turning their eyes to the facts rather than her narrative. I stayed calm. I didn't gloat, didn't shout, didn't even smile. I let them live in the consequences of their actions. The months of planning, the documentation, the careful cultivation of allies and knowledge, it all converged in this one moment. The power was mine because I had stayed disciplined, professional, and focused while they had relied on chaos, manipulation, and charm. The county clerk outlined the legal remedies in front of the neighbors. Owen could face charges for forgery and fraud, and Mom could be considered an accomplice if she had knowingly participated. I had the authority to press for restitution for the attempted property interference. No theatrics, just undeniable law and fact. By the time the meeting broke up, Owen and Mom were left standing in a room full of neighbors who now understood the truth. Whispers followed them as they left. Concern, shock, disbelief, and judgment. Some people I had worried might take their side now avoided them entirely. They were isolated, and for the first time in years, completely powerless. In the weeks that followed, Owen tried to salvage what he could. He made frantic calls, leaving voicemails that went unanswered. Mom attempted damage control with friends, but the evidence was overwhelming. Anyone who mattered had already seen it. Their credibility, carefully built over decades, had crumbled under the weight of truth and meticulous preparation. Meanwhile, I quietly reclaimed what was mine. The house, my work, my reputation, it all felt solid, untouchable. I continued to grow my business, strengthen my relationships, and solidify my independence. I didn't need revenge in the emotional sense. The fallout had done it for me. Justice had been served, not with shouting or confrontation, but with calm, meticulous strategy. One morning, I received a text from a neighbor I hadn't spoken to in months. Just wanted to say, "You handled everything perfectly. I can't believe the nerve of them. Proud of you." I didn't reply. I didn't need to. The message wasn't about recognition. It was a quiet affirmation that the truth, finally, was visible to everyone. I walked past the house, seeing the garden I'd nurtured, the signs of care and order in every corner. It struck me then that this wasn't just about winning a battle against Mom and Owen. It was about reclaiming my life from years of manipulation, cruelty, and entitlement. I didn't need to speak to them to feel victorious. They were living with the consequences of their own choices, and I was free. For the first time in a long time, I smiled fully, without tension or calculation. The past year's chaos, pain, and betrayal had been relentless, but I had endured, I had risen, and I had triumphed. And as I closed the gate behind me and walked down the driveway, I realized something that no argument, no insult, no manipulation could ever take away. I was the author of my own life.